My grandson Tyler slapped me across the face in front of 12 family members, and not one person said a word. Not my son David, not his wife Amanda, not even the cousins who used to call me their favorite grandma. That night, I made a phone call that would change everything. Within 6 months, Tyler was begging for forgiveness. But by then, I owned half the town, and his future was in my hands. Now David wishes he'd spoken up. Amanda pretends she never saw it happen. But me? I've never been more powerful, and I've never felt more at peace. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe and tell me in the comments. Have you ever had family treat you like you didn't matter? Share your story below. I turned 70 on a Tuesday in March, expecting nothing more than a quiet dinner with my family at my son David's house in Millbrook. The invitation had come 3 days late, scribbled on the back of one of Amanda's yoga studio flyers, and slipped under my door while I was at my weekly grocery run. No phone call, no proper invitation, just Mom's 70th, Tuesday 6 p.m. in David's. Messy handwriting. But I was grateful to be included at all. I'd spent 42 years raising David as a single mother after his father died in a construction accident when David was only 8 years old. Back then, we lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment above Murphy's hardware store on the wrong side of Millbrook. I worked double shifts at Branson Textile Mill, running industrial sewing machines from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., then cleaning offices from 7 p.m. to midnight just to keep food on the table, and David in decent clothes for school. I never missed a single one of his baseball games, even when my supervisor threatened to dock my pay. I was there in the bleachers with a thermos of coffee and a ham sandwich, cheering louder than any other parent when David hit his first home run in Little League. I saved every penny I could for his college fund, buying generic everything and wearing the same 3 work uniforms until they were more patch than original fabric. When David graduated valedictorian from Millbrook High, I cried so hard I had to borrow tissues from the woman sitting next to me. Now David lived in the biggest house on Elm Street, a sprawling colonial with white columns and a circular driveway that cost more than I'd made in 10 years at the mill. He was the regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, drove a BMW, and took family vacations to places I'd only seen in magazines. Amanda, his wife of 15 years, ran a boutique yoga studio called Mindful Movements and spent her afternoons at charity luncheons with other wives who'd never worked a day outside their pristine homes. Their 3 children, Tyler, 22, Madison, 16, and Emma, 8, had everything I'd never been able to give David. Private music lessons, summer, camps, designer clothes, and college funds that were already fully funded. I should have been proud. I was proud. But somewhere along the way, as David's life got shinier and more comfortable, mine seemed to become invisible. The dining room table was set for 13 when I arrived at 5:45 p.m., fashionably early as always. Fine china that Amanda had inherited from her grandmother, cloth napkins folded into perfect triangles, and candles that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. The guest list included David's family, Amanda's parents Harold and Patricia Westbrook, who owned 3 car dealerships and reminded everyone about it at least twice per conversation, and a handful of cousins from David's side who only showed up for major holidays and free meals. I brought my famous chocolate bourbon cake, the same recipe I'd been perfecting for 40 years. The cake that used to be the centerpiece of every family gathering that David used to request for his birthday. Every year until he turned 18, and Amanda started ordering elaborate designer cakes from the French bakery downtown. I'd spent my entire grocery budget for the week on the ingredients: real vanilla extract, premium cocoa powder, and a bottle of bourbon that cost more than my usual wine selection. But it was my 70th birthday, and I wanted to contribute something. Special Tyler, my oldest grandson, was already 3 beers deep when I arrived, sprawled in the dining room's head chair like he owned the place. At 22, Tyler was the spitting image of his father at that age, tall, broad-shouldered, with David's same dark hair and strong jawline. But where David had been disciplined and driven, Tyler was entitled and aimless. He'd dropped out of state, university after 2 semesters, claiming the professors didn't understand his learning style. Translation: he'd spent more time at fraternity parties than in class and flunked out spectacularly. For the past 4 years, Tyler had been living in David and Amanda's finished basement, supposedly figuring himself out, while spending his days playing video games online and his nights bouncing between bars in downtown Millbrook. David kept making excuses, kept giving him money for job interviews that never seemed to materialize into actual employment. Amanda would sigh and say Tyler was finding his path, as if laziness and disrespect were just stations on some cosmic journey to enlightenment. I'd tried to connect with Tyler over the years, really tried. I'd taken him fishing when he was younger, taught him how to change a tire, even helped him study for his SATs when David was too busy with work to sit down with him. But as Tyler got older, especially after he moved back into his parents' basement, he'd grown increasingly dismissive of me. I was just Grandma Margaret, the old woman who brought store-bought gifts instead of cash, who asked too many questions about his job prospects, who reminded him of responsibilities he'd rather ignore. Dinner started pleasant enough, the way these family gatherings always did before the alcohol kicked in and people started saying what they really thought. Amanda's mother, Patricia, complimented my dress, a navy blue outfit I'd bought at Kohl's specifically for the occasion, though I caught her scanning the label when she thought I wasn't looking. Cousin Jenny, David's second cousin who worked as a nurse at Millbrook General, asked about my garden and genuinely seemed interested in my tomato harvest from last summer. Little Emma, Tyler's 8-year-old sister, was the bright spot of the evening. She bounced over to my chair before we even sat down for dinner, clutching a crayon drawing she'd made of the 2 of us standing in front of a house with an enormous rainbow arching overhead. "This is you and me, Grandma Margaret," she said, pointing to 2 stick figures with huge smiles. "We're happy because we're together." I hugged her so tight she giggled and squirmed, and for a moment I remembered why I kept showing up to these increasingly uncomfortable family gatherings. Madison, the middle child at 16, was polite, but distant in that way teenagers perfect when they'd rather be anywhere else. She managed a few "hi, grandmas" and answered my questions about school with minimal enthusiasm before returning to her phone, probably texting friends about how boring family dinner was. I couldn't blame her. At 16, I would have felt the same way about being trapped at a table with relatives discussing mortgage rates and neighborhood gossip. As we moved from appetizers to the main course, Amanda had ordered catered food. From some upscale restaurant instead of cooking, which used to be a family tradition. I noticed Tyler getting progressively louder and more belligerent. He'd switched from beer to bourbon after the first course, helping himself to generous pours from the bar cart without asking. David noticed, but said nothing. Amanda shot him warning looks that Tyler either ignored or genuinely didn't see. The conversation flowed around typical family topics: David's latest promotion, Madison's upcoming piano recital, Harold's new boat purchase, Patricia's latest charity project. I contributed when I could, but mostly I just listened and smiled, grateful to be included, even if I felt like I was watching their lives through a window, rather than actually participating in them. It was when I stood up to cut my chocolate bourbon cake that Tyler's mood shifted from merely unpleasant to something darker. He'd been muttering under his breath about some argument he'd had with his on-again, off-again girlfriend Brittany. Something about her trying to pressure him into moving out of his parents' house and getting a real job. "She thinks she can tell me what to do," he slurred, gesturing with his bourbon glass and sloshing amber liquid onto Amanda's pristine tablecloth. "Just like every other woman in this family thinks they run everything. Always nagging, always pushing, never satisfied with anything." I kept slicing cake, my hands moving steadily through the familiar motions while my stomach tightened with each word. The room had gotten quieter, conversations trailing off as people tried to pretend they weren't listening to Tyler's increasingly bitter monologue. David cleared his throat and suggested maybe Tyler should take it easy, but Tyler waved him off dismissively. "I'm fine, Dad. Just tired of being lectured by people who don't understand what it's like to be young in this economy. Everyone expects you to just magically have everything figured out by the time you're 22. I wanted to point out that at 22, David had been working full-time while taking night classes to finish his degree. That at 22, I'd been raising an 8-year-old alone while working 2 jobs. But I bit my tongue and focused on arranging cake slices on Amanda's good china plates, the ones with tiny roses around the rim that she only brought out for special occasions. That's when Tyler knocked over Emma's juice cup. It happened fast. He was reaching for the bourbon bottle again, his coordination compromised by alcohol, and his elbow caught Emma's plastic cup full of apple juice. The cup tumbled sideways, sending a golden stream across the white tablecloth and directly onto Emma's favorite dress, the pink one with sparkles that she'd insisted on wearing for Grandma's special birthday. Emma burst into tears, not because the juice was cold or because her dress was ruined, but because she was 8 years old and loud noises and sudden chaos scared her. Amanda jumped up to clean the mess, shooting Tyler a look that could have melted steel while David handed Emma napkins and tried to calm her down. That's when I made my mistake. In the midst of the commotion, with Emma crying and Amanda frantically dabbing at the tablecloth and Tyler reaching for yet another drink like nothing had happened, I gently said, "Tyler, honey, maybe you should slow down a bit. It's supposed to be a celebration, and Emma's upset." The room went dead silent except for Emma's diminishing sniffles. Tyler's hand froze halfway to the bourbon bottle, and he turned to look at me with an expression I'd never seen before. His eyes, which used to light up when I brought him comic books or took him for ice cream, had gone flat and cold. For a second, he looked like a stranger wearing my grandson's face. "Don't you dare tell me what to do, old woman," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think because it's your birthday you get to boss everyone around? You're not in charge here anymore. You're just some old lady who shows up with store-bought cake acting like you still matter." The words hit me like physical blows. Store-bought. Cake, when I'd spent my grocery money on premium ingredients and stayed up until midnight making sure the layers were perfect. Old lady who shows up, when I'd driven 40 minutes through a thunderstorm to be here, when I'd never missed a family gathering in 22 years. Acting like you still matter, when all I'd done was try to help calm down a crying child. I stood there holding the cake server, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks and the familiar sting of tears I refused to let fall. Everyone was staring now, not at Tyler for his cruelty, but at me, waiting to see how I'd react to being publicly humiliated by my own grandson at my own birthday dinner. "Tyler, I just asked you to—" I started quietly, hoping to de-escalate the situation, hoping to salvage what was left of my 70th birthday celebration. That's when his hand flew across my face. The slap echoed through Amanda's pristine dining room, like a gunshot. My cheek burned, my glasses flew sideways across my nose, and the cake server clattered to the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed to go on forever. I felt the immediate heat rush to my face, tasted blood where I'd bitten my tongue, and felt something deeper than physical pain crack open in my chest. For a moment that stretched like taffy. Nobody moved. The candles flickered. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked. Emma had stopped crying entirely, her 8-year-old mind trying to process what she'd just witnessed. Madison looked up from her phone for the first time all evening, her mouth hanging open in shock. I looked around the table, my hand pressed to my burning cheek, waiting for someone, anyone, to stand up for me. Waiting for David to grab Tyler by the collar and throw him out of the house. Waiting for Amanda to defend the woman who'd helped pay for their wedding, who babysat their children when they needed date nights, who brought Christmas presents even when money was tight. Waiting for Harold and Patricia to express outrage that their daughter's family had just allowed a guest, a 70-year-old grandmother, to be assaulted at their dinner table. David went pale and opened his mouth, then closed it again like a fish gasping for air. Amanda stared at her plate as if the pattern of roses had suddenly become fascinating. Tyler's Uncle Mike, David's cousin who'd been laughing at Tyler's jokes all evening, suddenly found his phone incredibly important. Even Jenny, who used to defend me from neighborhood gossips when I was a struggling single mother, just sat there, frozen with her fork halfway to her mouth. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody told Tyler to apologize or leave or even asked if I was okay. The silence stretched until it became its own entity, thick and choking and full of everything that should have been said but wasn't. Tyler, emboldened by the lack of response, took another swig of bourbon and muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Maybe now you'll learn to keep your mouth shut, Grandma." I stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably 30 seconds, my hand still pressed to my burning cheek, looking at these people who I'd loved and supported and sacrificed for my entire adult life. People who were willing to watch their 70-year-old mother and grandmother get hit by a drunk 22-year-old and pretend it didn't happen. People who valued keeping the peace more than protecting someone who'd spent decades protecting them. The realization hit me harder than Tyler's hand had. This wasn't shock. This wasn't temporary paralysis in the face of unexpected violence. This was a choice. They were choosing Tyler's comfort over my dignity. They were choosing to enable his behavior rather than confront it. They were choosing to sacrifice me to avoid an uncomfortable conversation about boundaries and consequences. In that moment, something fundamental shifted inside me. The part of me that had spent 70 years trying to be useful, trying to be needed, trying to earn love through service and sacrifice and endless patience, that part died right there in Amanda's dining room between the flickering candles and the ruined tablecloth. Finally, I bent down, picked up the cake server with hands that barely trembled, and placed it carefully beside the remainder of my chocolate bourbon cake that nobody had touched. I picked up my purse, walked to the front door with my spine straight and my head high, and turned back to face the table full of people who were still pretending nothing had happened. "Thank you for a memorable 70th birthday," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I'll be sure to remember this evening for the rest of my life." Then I walked out into the March night, got into my 15-year-old Honda Civic, and drove home to my little house on Maple Street. I sat in my kitchen with a bag of frozen peas pressed to my swelling cheek and stared at the phone number I'd kept in my address book for 15 years, but never had the courage to call. Margaret Blackwood had been my maiden name. Margaret Blackwood had been poor but proud, hard-working but hopeful. Margaret Blackwood had believed that love and loyalty were earned through sacrifice and that family was worth any price. But Margaret Blackwood was dead now, killed by Tyler's hand and everyone else's silence. The woman who dialed that number at 11:30 p.m. on her 70th birthday was someone new. Someone who'd finally learned that respect couldn't be earned through service, that dignity couldn't be purchased with devotion, and that sometimes the only way to teach people your worth was to show them the cost of losing you. I dialed the number I'd memorized but never used, a number that belonged to someone who'd been trying to reach me for 15 years, someone who could give me something Tyler would never see coming. Power. The number belonged to Vincent Morrison, and calling him at 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday night should have been impossible. Vincent Morrison was the kind of man who had assistants to handle his assistants, who owned buildings instead of apartments, who made decisions that affected thousands of people's lives before his morning coffee grew cold. But 15 years ago, Vincent Morrison had given me his personal cell phone number and made me promise to call if I ever needed anything. Anything at all. I'd never called. Not once in 15 years. Vincent Morrison had been my employer during the strangest 6 months of my life, back when I was 55 and David was just starting his pharmaceutical career. It was 2008, and the economy had collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Branson Textile Mill, where I'd worked for 27 years, had closed its doors permanently, taking my steady paycheck and my health insurance with it. David was struggling to establish himself in his new job. Amanda was pregnant with Madison, and suddenly my reliable, predictable life had turned into a daily exercise in survival. I'd applied for every job I could find: cashier positions, cleaning, services, office work. But nobody wanted to hire a 55-year-old woman with nothing but textile experience and a high school diploma. My unemployment benefits barely covered my rent, and my savings account was shrinking faster than ice cream in August. I was 3 months behind on my mortgage when I saw the ad in the Millbrook Herald's classified section. Housekeeper wanted, mature, discreet, live-in position, excellent compensation, references required. The address was 1247 Ocean View Drive, up in the hills where Millbrook's wealthiest residents lived behind gates and landscaped driveways. I'd driven past those houses 1,000 times, but never imagined I'd be walking up to one of their front doors with a resume and a desperate hope that someone would give me a chance. The Morrison estate wasn't just a house. It was a monument to success. 3 stories of gleaming white stone, with floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the sky like mirrors and a circular driveway that could have accommodated a small wedding reception. The grounds stretched for what looked like acres, with perfectly manicured gardens, a tennis court, and what appeared to be a guest house that was larger than most people's primary residences. Vincent Morrison answered the door himself, which surprised me. I'd expected a butler or at least a formal housekeeper to handle the interview process. Instead, there was Vincent, tall, silver-haired, wearing an expensive sweater and jeans that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, looking at me with sharp gray eyes that seemed to catalog everything about me in the span of 3 seconds. "You must be Margaret," he said, extending his hand for a firm handshake. "I'm Vincent. Thank you for coming." The interview took place in his study, a room lined floor to ceiling with books and dominated by a mahogany desk the size of my kitchen table. Vincent poured coffee from a silver service and asked questions that had nothing to do with cleaning or cooking. He wanted to know about my family, my interests, my thoughts on everything from current events to my favorite books. It felt less like a job interview and more like a conversation with an old friend I hadn't seen in years. I should be honest. "With you, Margaret," Vincent said after an hour of surprisingly pleasant discussion. "I don't actually need a traditional housekeeper. I have a cleaning service that comes twice a week, and I eat most of my meals at restaurants or business dinners. What I need is something different." I waited, wondering if this was where the interview took an uncomfortable turn. Vincent leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers under his chin. "I'm 58 years old, and I've spent the last 30 years building Morrison Development from a 2-man operation into one of the largest commercial real estate companies on the East Coast. I own shopping centers, office buildings, apartment complexes, and more rental properties than I can count without consulting my accountant. I make more money in a month than most people see in 5 years." He paused, looking out the window at his perfectly maintained grounds. "I'm also completely alone. My ex-wife lives in France with her yoga instructor. My daughter speaks to me twice a year, usually when she needs money. My son died in a car accident 3 years ago. I have business associates, golf partners, and people who laugh at my jokes because I sign their paychecks, but I don't have a single person in my life who gives a damn about me as a human being." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. This was a man who could buy anything he wanted, go anywhere he pleased, command respect and attention with a phone call, and he was admitting to a near stranger that he was lonely. "What I need," Vincent continued, "is someone I can trust. Someone to manage this house, yes, but also someone to talk to. Someone to remind me that there's a world outside of profit margins and quarterly reports. Someone who isn't trying to get something from me besides fair compensation for honest work." He offered me $80,000 a year, more than double what I'd been making at the textile mill, plus full health insurance, a furnished apartment above the garage, and 2 weeks of paid vacation. In exchange, I would manage his household, coordinate with his various service providers, handle his personal correspondence, and simply be present. Be a human being in his life who wasn't there because of what he could do for them professionally. I should have been suspicious. I should have wondered what the catch was, why a successful businessman would pay that kind of money for what amounted to companionship with household management duties. But I was 3 months behind on my mortgage. David was struggling with his own financial pressures, and Vincent Morrison was offering me a lifeline when I was drowning. The 6 months I spent working for Vincent changed both of our lives in ways neither of us expected. The work itself was surprisingly easy, managing deliveries, coordinating with his landscaping and cleaning services, handling his personal calendar, and making sure his massive house felt like a home instead of a showcase. But the real value I provided was something neither of us had anticipated. I treated him like a person instead of a commodity. We fell into routines that had nothing to do with employer and employee relationships. Vincent would come home from 12-hour days at the office, and instead of disappearing into his study with a scotch and financial reports, he'd join me in the kitchen while I prepared dinner. We'd talk about everything, his business challenges, my worries about David's career, books we'd read, places we wanted to travel, memories from our childhoods that shaped who we'd become. Vincent told me about his son Michael, who'd been killed by a drunk driver while driving home from his job as a social worker. Michael had been the family idealist, the one who chose helping people over making money, and Vincent blamed himself for not appreciating that choice while his son was alive. He showed me photos of Michael working with homeless veterans, organizing community gardens, coaching Little League baseball for kids whose parents couldn't afford the equipment fees. I told Vincent about raising David alone, about the nights I'd fallen asleep at the kitchen table trying to balance checkbooks that never quite balanced, about the pride I'd felt watching David graduate valedictorian despite all the obstacles we'd faced. I told him about my fears that David was growing away from me as his success increased, that I was becoming irrelevant in his increasingly sophisticated life. Success doesn't have to mean forgetting where you came from, Vincent said one evening, as we shared coffee and watched the sunset from his back terrace. But sometimes it takes conscious effort to remember. David's not growing away from you. He's probably just trying to prove he can stand on his own 2 feet without constantly needing his mother's help. Vincent was right about a lot of things, I learned. He had an uncanny ability to see through people's surface motivations to their deeper needs and fears. He'd built his business empire partly through that insight, understanding what people really wanted, not just what they said they wanted. As the months passed, Vincent and I became genuine friends. He valued my perspective on his business decisions, asking my opinion about everything from employee relations to community development projects. I helped him reconnect with his daughter Sarah, who lived in California and had assumed her father was too busy making money to care about repairing their relationship. With my encouragement, Vincent started calling Sarah regularly, not to discuss business or money, but just to hear about her life as a high school art teacher. But the most significant thing Vincent did during those 6 months was share his knowledge with me. Not just household management or social skills, but real knowledge about money, business, and power. He taught me how to read financial statements, how to evaluate real estate investments, how to understand the difference between assets and liabilities. He showed me how wealthy people thought about money, not as something to spend or save, but as a tool to create more opportunities. Most people work for money, Vincent explained one evening as he walked me through his investment portfolio. Wealthy people make money work for them. The difference isn't how much you start with. It's understanding how money moves and multiplies. He introduced me to his accountant, his lawyer, his financial advisor, not as his housekeeper, but as someone he respected and wanted to see succeed. When I mentioned that I'd always dreamed of maybe owning a small rental property someday, Vincent spent hours explaining property investment strategies, helping me understand mortgage structures and cash flow analysis. The arrangement was supposed to last a year, but after 6 months, Vincent's business expanded into international markets, requiring him to travel extensively. He offered to take me with him as a personal assistant, but David had just gotten engaged to Amanda, and I wanted to be present for that chapter of his life. Vincent understood completely. On my last day of work, Vincent called me into his study and handed me an envelope containing my final paycheck, plus a $50,000 bonus that took my breath away. "This isn't charity, Margaret," he said when I tried to protest. "This is the best investment I've made in years. You've given me something I'd forgotten I needed. The experience of being valued for who I am, not what I own. That's worth more than any amount of money." But the money wasn't the most valuable gift Vincent gave me that day. Along with the check, he handed me a business card with his personal cell phone number handwritten on the back. "If you ever need anything, and I mean anything, you call this number. Day or night doesn't matter. I owe you a debt I can never fully repay, and I don't forget my debts." I protested that he didn't owe me anything, that he'd already been more generous than I'd ever dreamed possible. Vincent just smiled and shook his head. "You'll understand someday, Margaret. There's a difference between being rich and being wealthy. Rich is having money. Wealthy is having options. When you're ready. For options, you call me." With Vincent's bonus and my savings from those 6 months of generous salary, I was able to pay off my mortgage completely and still have money left over. I invested some of it using the strategies Vincent had taught me, buying a small duplex on the other side of town and renting it out for steady monthly income. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't living paycheck to paycheck. But more importantly, those 6 months had changed how I saw myself. I'd spent 27 years at the textile mill thinking my only value was my ability to work hard and follow instructions. Vincent had shown me that my perspectives, my insights, my ability to connect with people and see through surface presentations to deeper truths, those things had value too. Real value that sophisticated, successful people were willing to pay for. When David and Amanda's wedding planning got stressful, I was the one Amanda's mother called for advice about managing family dynamics. When David got promoted and needed to relocate temporarily for training, I was the one who helped them find short-term housing and coordinate the logistics. When Madison was born and Amanda struggled with postpartum depression, I was the one who knew how to help without making Amanda feel inadequate or judged. I'd become someone people turned to for solutions, not just sympathy. Someone whose opinion mattered, whose presence made situations better rather than more complicated. Vincent had seen that potential in me before I'd seen it in myself. Over the years, Vincent and I stayed in touch through Christmas cards and occasional phone calls. He sent announcements when his business expanded into new markets, when his daughter Sarah got married, when he was featured in business magazines for his philanthropic work. I sent updates about David's promotions, the grandchildren's milestones, my small but growing real estate investments. Vincent had remarried 4 years ago, a woman named Elena who ran a nonprofit organization focused on affordable housing development. From his Christmas card photos, they looked genuinely happy together, and I was glad he'd found someone who appreciated both his success and his humanity. But I'd never called that personal number. Never had a reason to, really. My life had been stable, predictable, manageable. I had my small house, my rental property, my weekly dinners with David's family, my garden club meetings, my routine medical appointments. Nothing dramatic enough to require the kind of help that Vincent Morrison could provide. Until Tyler's hand connected with my cheek, and everything I thought I knew about my place in the world shattered like glass. Now, sitting in my kitchen at 11:30 p.m., with a bag of frozen peas pressed against my swelling face, I stared at that business card I'd kept in my address book for 15 years. The edges were soft with age, the ink slightly faded, but Vincent's handwritten number was still clearly legible. My hands shook slightly as I dialed. The phone rang once, twice, and I started to wonder if the number was even still active after all these years. Maybe Vincent had changed phones, moved offices, forgotten about the promise he'd made to a former housekeeper who'd helped him remember how to be human. On the third ring, Vincent's voice came through the line, alert and concerned despite the late hour. "Margaret, is that you? Are you all right?" The relief in hearing his voice, the immediate recognition and genuine concern, almost broke my composure entirely. Vincent Morrison, who probably fielded dozens of business calls every day from people wanting favors or opportunities or access to his resources, had recognized my voice instantly, and his first thought was for my well-being. "Hello, Vincent." I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm sorry to call so late, but you said to call if I ever needed anything." "Of course. What's happened? Are you hurt? Do you need me to send someone to help you?" I took a deep breath and told him everything. The birthday dinner, Tyler's drinking and hostility, the moment when he slapped me in front of 12 family members who said nothing. The silence that followed, the realization that I'd become expendable in my own family, the crushing understanding that 70 years of love and sacrifice had earned me nothing but tolerance. Vincent listened without interrupting, occasionally, making small sounds of sympathy or outrage, but mostly just letting me tell the story at my own pace. When I finished, there was a long pause before he spoke. "Margaret, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you want justice, or do you want revenge?" The distinction caught me off guard. "What's the difference?" "Justice would be making sure Tyler faces consequences for his behavior, and your family understands how badly they failed you tonight. Revenge would be making them all pay a price that's proportional to the pain they've caused. Justice restores balance. Revenge shifts the power dynamic permanently in your favor." I thought about Tyler's sneer as he called me an old woman who didn't matter. I thought about David's paralyzed silence when his own son assaulted his mother. I thought about Amanda's refusal to even look at me after I'd been hit. I thought about all the ways I'd made myself smaller over the years to make them more comfortable, all the times I'd accepted less than I deserved because maintaining family. Harmony seemed more important than maintaining my dignity. "I want them to understand what they've lost," I said finally. "I want them to realize that treating me like I'm disposable was the biggest mistake they've ever made." "Then you want revenge," Vincent said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Good. Justice is for people who still believe the system will protect them. Revenge is for people who are ready to change the system entirely." He paused, and I could hear the sound of papers rustling, as if he was already making notes. "Margaret, do you remember what I taught you about the difference between being rich and being wealthy? Rich is having money. Wealthy is having options." "Exactly. And Tyler, for all his arrogance and entitlement, has neither. He's completely dependent on his parents for housing, food, spending money, and social status. David and Amanda have money, but their wealth is tied up in their lifestyle. The big house, the luxury cars, Amanda's boutique business that barely breaks even, their country club memberships, the private schools for Madison and Emma. They live, well, but they don't have the kind of liquid assets or investment flexibility that creates real power." I could hear Vincent's mind working, the same strategic thinking that had built his empire now focused on my problem. "I've been watching Millbrook's real estate market for the past few years," Vincent continued. "The downtown area is primed for major development. New businesses, upscale housing, commercial opportunities. I've been looking for the right local partner to help me establish a presence there. Someone who understands the community, who has credibility with longtime residents, who can help me navigate the social and political landscape." My heart started beating faster as I began to understand what Vincent was suggesting. "Margaret, I'm prepared to make you a full partner in Morrison Development's Millbrook expansion. We're talking about a multi-million-dollar investment in commercial and residential properties, retail development, and community infrastructure. As my partner, you'd have decision-making authority over which projects get approved, which businesses get premium locations, which families get access to the most desirable new housing developments." The implications hit me like a lightning bolt. Tyler was unemployed and unemployable in a small town where word traveled fast about attitude problems and reliability issues. David's pharmaceutical sales territory included most of the businesses Vincent was planning to develop. Amanda's yoga studio was located in a building that was scheduled for renovation or demolition depending on development plans. They don't know who you really are, Vincent said softly. They see you as the old woman who brings store-bought cake and asks too many questions about Tyler's job prospects. They have no idea that you spent 6 months learning business strategy from one of the most successful developers on the East Coast. They don't know about your rental property investments or your understanding of cash flow analysis. They've never seen you as anything other than David's mother who used to work at the textile mill. He was right. In 15 years, I'd never mentioned my time working for Vincent to David or Amanda. It had felt like bragging somehow, or like I was trying to make myself seem more important than I was. I'd been proud of the experience, but I'd kept it private, just like I'd kept most of my financial improvements private. David knew I'd paid off my mortgage and seemed stable, but he had no idea about the scope of my investments or the education Vincent had given me about business and finance. Margaret, I can make you one of the most powerful people in Millbrook, property owner, business partner, community decision maker. Tyler won't just regret slapping you. He'll spend the rest of his life knowing that his grandmother controls his access to employment, housing, and social opportunities in the only town he's ever known. David and Amanda won't just regret staying silent. They'll have to come to you for approval on everything from business expansions to school board positions. I can have contracts drawn up by tomorrow afternoon. We can establish Morrison Blackwood Development as a limited liability company with you holding 49% ownership and decision-making authority. I'll provide the capital, you'll provide the local expertise and community management. We can be breaking ground on the first properties within 60 days. Morrison Blackwood Development, my maiden name, the name I'd been born with before marriage and motherhood, and decades of making myself smaller to fit other people's expectations. The name of the woman who'd worked double shifts and raised a son alone and learned business strategy from one of the most successful men in commercial real estate. Vincent, I said, my voice stronger than it had been all evening. Let's do it. Excellent. I'll have my lawyers start the paperwork tonight. Margaret, there's one more thing you should know. This isn't charity or sympathy. This is business. You're going to work harder than you've ever worked, make decisions that affect hundreds of people's lives, and face criticism from people who think you don't deserve the power you'll have. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Tyler's sneer, about David's silence, about Amanda's averted eyes. I thought about 70 years of being grateful for scraps when I should have been demanding the feast I'd earned. Vincent, I've been preparing for this my whole life. I just didn't know it. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen until dawn, watching the sun rise over Millbrook and thinking about how different the town would look in 6 months when I owned a significant portion of it. Tyler had slapped me because he thought I was powerless. David had stayed silent because he thought I was disposable. Amanda had looked away because she thought I was irrelevant. They were all about to learn exactly how wrong they'd been. The contracts arrived by special courier at 2:30 p.m. the next day, exactly 18 hours after my conversation with Vincent. I was in my garden, deadheading roses and trying to process the magnitude of what I'd agreed to, when a black town car pulled into my driveway. A young man in an expensive suit emerged carrying a leather portfolio that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Mrs. Blackwood? He asked, reading from a notepad. I'm James Chen from Morrison Development's legal department. Mr. Morrison asked me to deliver these documents personally and answer any questions you might have. Mrs. Blackwood. Not Mrs. Henderson, my married name that I'd carried for 45 years. Vincent had already begun the transformation, referring to me by the name that would appear on our business partnership. The name that would command respect in boardrooms and city planning meetings. The name that Tyler would learn to fear. James spread the contracts across my kitchen table with the precision of someone who handled million-dollar deals before lunch every day. The paperwork was extensive: corporate bylaws, partnership agreements, financial disclosures, property acquisition authorizations. As I read through each section, James explained the implications in terms that were both respectful of my intelligence and accessible to someone who hadn't spent decades in corporate law. The initial capital investment from Morrison Development will be $12 million, James said, pointing to a line item that made my hands tremble slightly. This will be allocated across property acquisition, development costs, legal fees, and operational expenses for the first 2 years. As managing partner for the Millbrook expansion, you'll have signature authority on all expenditures under $50,000 and co-signature requirements with Mr. Morrison for larger investments. $50,000. More than I'd made in a year at the textile mill. And Vincent was giving me the authority to spend that amount with a simple signature. The trust implicit in that arrangement was both humbling and terrifying. Your compensation structure includes a base salary of $120,000 annually, plus performance bonuses tied to project completion and profitability metrics. You'll also receive health insurance, a company vehicle allowance, and a discretionary budget for community relations and networking activities. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside I was reeling. $120,000 was more money than I'd ever imagined earning, even during my most optimistic moments working for Vincent 15 years ago. Combined with my rental property income and my modest investments, I would go from comfortable to genuinely wealthy almost overnight. But the money, significant as it was, wasn't the real power Vincent was handing me. That lay in the detailed property acquisition list James showed me next. These are the target properties Mr. Morrison has identified for potential development, James said, spreading out a map of downtown Millbrook marked with colored pins. Red pins indicate priority acquisitions, yellow pins are secondary targets, and green pins represent properties we're monitoring for future opportunities. I studied the map with growing amazement. Vincent hadn't just been watching Millbrook's real estate market casually. He'd been conducting a comprehensive analysis that revealed an understanding of the town's economic and social dynamics that exceeded my own, despite having lived here my entire life. The red pins clustered around 3 strategic areas: the downtown business district, the waterfront development zone near the old ferry landing, and the residential area between Millbrook High School and the community college. Each location represented a different aspect of community life: commerce, recreation, and family housing. Mr. Morrison's research indicates that Millbrook is positioned for significant growth over the next 5 to 10 years, James continued. The proximity to major metropolitan areas, combined with relatively affordable property values and strong school systems, makes it attractive for both young families and retirees looking for small-town quality of life with urban accessibility. One red pin caught my attention immediately. It marked the building that housed Amanda's yoga studio, Mindful Movements, along with a small cafe, a bookstore, and 2 other retail businesses. According to the acquisition notes, the building's current owner was behind on property taxes and had been trying to sell for over a year without success. "This property here," I said, pointing to Amanda's building. "What's the timeline for acquisition?" James consulted his notes. "The owner, Robert Hartley, has been in preliminary discussions with our acquisition team for 6 weeks. He's asking $200,000, but our assessment suggests the property is worth closer to $160 given the deferred maintenance and tax liens. We could likely close within 30 days if you approve the purchase." $200,000, a sum that would have been unimaginable to me just 24 hours ago, but now represented a single line item in a $12 million development budget. More importantly, it represented control over Amanda's business location and, by extension, her financial stability. "What would be the development timeline for a property like this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Depends on your vision for the space. We could renovate and lease to upscale tenants, convert to mixed-use residential and commercial, or demolish and rebuild entirely. The current tenants have month-to-month leases, so we'd have flexibility in terms of occupancy changes. Month-to-month leases. Amanda had mentioned last Christmas that she was frustrated with her lease terms, but couldn't afford to move to a more expensive location. She had no idea how precarious her situation actually was, or that her future landlord might soon be her former mother-in-law, whom Tyler had dismissed as irrelevant. I continued studying the map, noting other strategic acquisitions that would affect people I knew. The yellow pins included the office building where David's pharmaceutical company leased space for their regional headquarters. The green pins marked residential properties in the neighborhood where several of my cousins lived, including Jenny, who had sat silently at my birthday dinner. Mr. Morrison mentioned that you have extensive knowledge of the local community, James said. He's particularly interested in your insights about which businesses and residents would be most receptive to development opportunities versus those who might resist change. This was where my value to Vincent became clear. He could analyze market trends and financial projections from his office in the city, but he needed someone who understood the human dynamics of small-town politics. Someone who knew which families had influence, which business owners were struggling, which community leaders could be allies or obstacles in the development process. There are several key people you'll want to meet, I said, my mind all ready, working through the social and political landscape of Millbrook. Mayor Patricia Wells has been in office for 12 years and generally supports development that brings jobs and tax revenue. City Council member Frank Morrison, no relation to Vincent, owns 3 local businesses and has significant influence over zoning decisions. The president of the Chamber of Commerce is Helen Rodriguez, and she's very focused on maintaining Millbrook's small-town character while encouraging economic growth. James took notes as I spoke, occasionally asking follow-up questions about specific individuals or their potential concerns about large-scale development. I found myself slipping into a role I'd never occupied before: strategic advisor, community, liaison, the bridge between Vincent's resources and Millbrook's needs. Mr. Morrison also wanted me to discuss the timeline for public announcement of the partnership, James said after we'd covered the major community stakeholders. He suggests a soft launch approach, beginning the property acquisitions and development, planning quietly, then announcing Morrison Blackwood development once we have several projects underway and can demonstrate concrete benefits to the community. How long would that take? Based on similar expansions Mr. Morrison has managed, approximately 4 to 6 months. Long enough to establish momentum, but short enough to maintain the element of surprise. 4 to 6 months. By the time Tyler learned that his grandmother was a major property owner and business partner in the most significant development project in Millbrook's history, it would be too late for him or anyone else to influence or undermine the process. The foundation of my new life would already be solidly established. James packed up the contracts after I'd signed each document with my maiden name, Margaret Blackwood, in handwriting that looked stronger and more confident than I felt. As he prepared to leave, he handed me a business card and a set of keys. "Mr. Morrison asked me to give you these," he said. "The card has contact information for your new administrative assistant, Maria Santos. She'll handle scheduling, correspondence, and logistics coordination. The keys are for your new office." "My office?" Mr. Morrison leased space in the Millbrook Professional Center on Main Street. 3rd floor, corner suite. Maria has already arranged for furniture and equipment installation. You'll be operational by Monday morning. After James left, I sat in my kitchen staring at the keys to an office I'd never seen, in a building I'd driven past thousands of times without ever imagining I'd work there. The brass keyring was engraved with Morrison Blackwood Development in elegant script letters, physical proof that the conversation with Vincent hadn't been a grief-induced hallucination. I drove downtown to see the office, more out of curiosity than necessity, but also because I needed to start thinking of Main Street as my territory rather than just the place where I did my grocery shopping and banking. The Millbrook Professional Center was a 4-story brick building that housed lawyers, accountants, insurance agents, and other white-collar professionals. I'd always felt slightly intimidated walking into that building, as if my textile mill, background, and Kmart clothes marked me as someone who didn't belong in such polished surroundings. Now, I rode the elevator to the 3rd floor with a set of keys in my hand and legal authority to spend $50,000 without asking anyone's permission. The corner suite was larger than my living room, with windows overlooking Main Street and the town square. Maria Santos had indeed been busy. The space was furnished with a mahogany desk that matched the quality of Vincent's study, leather chairs, filing cabinets, and a conference table that could seat 8 people. A nameplate on the desk read, "Margaret Blackwood, Managing Partner." I sat in the leather chair behind the desk and looked out at Main Street, watching people I'd known for decades going about their Thursday afternoon routines. Mrs. Patterson, from the library walking her small dog. Tom Bradley, who'd been David's Little League coach, coming out of the hardware store. Amanda's friend Jessica, loading shopping bags into her SUV, probably heading home to cook dinner for a family that took her presence for granted. None of them knew that the 70-year-old woman they'd seen get slapped at a birthday dinner 2 days. Ego was now sitting in a corner office with the power to reshape their town. None of them could have imagined that Margaret Henderson, the quiet grandmother who brought store-bought cake to family gatherings, had been replaced by Margaret Blackwood, business partner to one of the most successful developers on the East Coast. My phone rang, interrupting my reverie. The caller ID showed David's number, the first contact I'd had from any family member since walking out of his house Tuesday night. "Hi, Mom." David's voice was careful, cautious, the tone he used, when he wasn't sure what kind of reaction he might get. "I wanted to check on you. You left pretty quickly Tuesday night, and we were concerned. Concerned. Not sorry. Not ashamed. Not horrified that they'd allowed Tyler to assault me without consequence. Concerned, as if I were the problem that needed to be managed rather than the victim who deserved an apology." "I'm fine, David," I said, my voice steady and professional. "Just processing what happened." "Look, Mom, about Tyler. He was really drunk, and he's been going through a rough time with Brittany and the job situation. That doesn't excuse what he did, but he's not usually... he's never..." David trailed off, apparently realizing that there was no way to finish that sentence without admitting that Tyler had assaulted his grandmother and that David had done nothing to stop it or address it afterward. "Has Tyler apologized?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He's been sleeping it off since Tuesday night. You know how he gets when he drinks too much, but I'm sure once he sobers up and processes what happened, he'll want to make things right." Tyler had been sleeping it off for 2 days. Not calling to apologize, not showing up at my door with flowers and genuine remorse, not even asking David to convey his regret. Just sleeping, as if hitting his grandmother was equivalent to a hangover that would resolve itself with time and hydration. "David, I need you to understand something," I said, looking out my new office window at the town I was about to help transform. "What happened Tuesday night wasn't just about Tyler being drunk. It was about everyone in that room deciding that my dignity was less important than avoiding an uncomfortable conversation, including you. Mom, I know I should have said something immediately, but it happened so fast, and I was in shock, and you had 2 days to call and apologize for your failure to protect me. You had 2 days to tell Tyler that his behavior was unacceptable, and that he needed to make amends. Instead, you waited until today to call and check if I was okay, as if this is something that just blows over if you ignore it long enough." The silence on David's end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, he spoke in a voice that sounded younger and more uncertain than I'd heard in years. "What do you want me to do, Mom? Tell me how to fix this. I want you to understand that some things can't be fixed, David. They can only be learned from. And the lesson here is that actions have consequences, even when those actions are silence and inaction. Are you saying you don't want to see us anymore? The kids keep asking where Grandma Margaret is, and I don't know what to tell them. Emma and Madison. In my anger and hurt, I'd been focused on Tyler, David, and Amanda, the adults who had chosen to enable Tyler's behavior through their silence. But Emma was 8 years old, and Madison was 16, and neither of them had been responsible for the adults' failures. I want to see Emma and Madison, I said carefully, but that will need to be arranged separately from family gatherings that include Tyler until he demonstrates genuine remorse and behavioral change. Tyler's not a bad kid, Mom. He's just lost right now. Tyler is a 22-year-old man who physically assaulted his 70-year-old grandmother because she asked him to stop drinking so heavily that he was making a child cry. If you think that behavior will improve without serious consequences, you're enabling him in a way that will ultimately destroy whatever decent person might still exist underneath his entitlement and self-pity. Another long pause. When David spoke again, his voice carried a note of something I couldn't quite identify. Maybe respect, maybe fear. You sound different, Mom. Stronger somehow. I am different, David. Tuesday night changed me in ways you don't understand yet, but you will. After hanging up, I sat in my new office for another hour, making lists of people I needed to contact, properties I wanted to research, and strategies for approaching the community development project. For the first time since Tuesday night, I felt like myself again. Not the diminished version of myself that had been apologizing for taking up space at family gatherings, but the woman who had worked double shifts to raise a son alone, who had impressed Vincent Morrison enough that he'd trusted her with his business secrets, who had built a small real estate portfolio through careful planning and intelligent risk-taking. Margaret Blackwood was back, and she had work to do. That evening, I drove past David's house on Elm Street, not to visit, but to observe. The lights were on in the kitchen and family room, and I could see figures moving behind the curtains, probably Amanda cleaning up after dinner while David helped Emma with homework, and Madison texted friends about weekend plans. Tyler's beat up. Honda was in the driveway, which meant he was still living in the basement, still unemployed, still avoiding responsibility for his actions. From the outside, it looked like the perfect family home. Large, well-maintained, comfortable, secure. David and Amanda had achieved the American dream of upward mobility, creating a life for their children that was materially better than anything they'd experienced growing up. But inside that house lived a 22-year-old man who thought he could solve problems with violence, and parents who thought they could solve problems by pretending they didn't exist. I continued driving through the neighborhoods where I'd lived my entire life, seeing them now through the lens of my new role as community development partner. Which areas needed infrastructure improvements? Which families might benefit from job opportunities in new businesses? Which longtime residents might resist change, and how could their concerns be addressed respectfully? By the time I returned, home to my small house on Maple Street, I had filled a notebook with observations and ideas. I made myself a cup of tea, sat at my kitchen table where I'd signed the contracts that morning, and called Vincent to report on my first day as his business partner. Margaret. Vincent's voice carried the warmth of genuine pleasure. How did the meeting with James go? Are you comfortable with the partnership structure? More than comfortable, I said. I'm excited. And grateful. And probably a little terrified, but in a good way. Excellent. Fear is healthy when you're taking on new challenges. It means you understand the magnitude of what we're attempting. James mentioned that you provided valuable insights about community, leadership, and potential resistance points. Vincent, I've been thinking about the timeline for a public announcement. 6 months might be too long. Oh? What are you thinking? Tyler's unemployment isn't just a personal problem. It's becoming a community issue. He's been getting into arguments at local bars, causing problems for other young people, creating a reputation that reflects badly on David and Amanda. If we wait 6 months to establish Morrison Blackwood Development, Tyler might do something that forces a family crisis before we're ready to demonstrate our position of strength. Vincent was quiet for a moment, and I could hear him thinking through the implications. What would you suggest as an alternative timeline? 3 months. Long enough to acquire key properties and establish our presence, but short enough that Tyler doesn't have time to create more problems that complicate the family dynamics. 3 months. Vincent's tone suggested he was already adjusting his mental timeline and resource allocation. That's aggressive, but manageable. We'd need to accelerate the property acquisition process and front-load some of the community relations. Work! I'm ready for that pace, Vincent. I've spent 70 years being patient. I think I'm done with patience. Vincent laughed, a sound of genuine appreciation and maybe a little bit of pride. Margaret, I think this partnership is going to be even more interesting than I anticipated. Let's do it in 3 months. After ending the call, I walked through my small house one more time, knowing that while I would always own this place, it would never again be the center of my world. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of becoming someone new, someone with power, influence, and the resources to ensure that respect was no longer optional but required. Tyler had slapped me because he thought I was weak. David had stayed silent because he thought I was disposable. Amanda had looked away because she thought I was irrelevant. In 3 months, they would all learn that the woman they had dismissed as a powerless old lady was actually the person who controlled their access to employment, housing, business opportunities, and social standing in the only town they'd ever known. The transformation had begun. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made everything feel possible. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror at 6:30 a.m., choosing my outfit for my first official day as managing partner of Morrison Blackwood Development. Gone were the comfortable slacks and floral blouses that had been my uniform for family gatherings and grocery store trips. Instead, I selected a charcoal gray blazer and matching skirt that I'd purchased Saturday afternoon from the most expensive boutique in Millbrook, a store I'd window shopped at for years but never imagined I could afford. The transformation wasn't just external. As I applied makeup with more precision than I'd used in decades and styled my silver hair into a professional chignon, I felt something fundamental shifting inside me. Margaret Henderson had been apologetic, deferential, grateful for whatever scraps of attention her family threw her way. Margaret Blackwood was confident, strategic, and nobody's victim. My new administrative assistant, Maria Santos, had left detailed notes about my morning schedule. 3 property viewing appointments, a lunch meeting with Mayor Patricia Wells, and a 2 p.m. conference call with Vincent to review acquisition priorities. The kind of packed schedule that would have overwhelmed me a week ago now felt energizing, purposeful. The first property viewing was at 8 a.m., the building that housed Amanda's yoga studio, as I pulled into the parking lot in my 15-year-old's Honda Civic. I made a mental note to arrange for the company vehicle that was part of my compensation package. Arriving at million-dollar real estate deals in a car with a dented fender and 180,000 miles didn't exactly project the image of a serious business partner. Robert Hartley, the building's current owner, met me at the front entrance with the desperate eagerness of someone who'd been trying to sell for over a year. He was in his mid-60s, wearing a wrinkled polo shirt and jeans that had seen better days, with the defeated posture of a man who'd watched his retirement savings shrink while property taxes and maintenance costs continued to climb. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, extending a calloused hand. "I can't tell you how excited I am about Morrison Development's interest in this property. I've been hoping someone with vision would see the potential here." As we walked through the building, Robert pointed out features with the enthusiasm of someone trying to convince himself as much as me. "The retail spaces on the ground floor have excellent street visibility, and the upper floor could easily be converted to office space or residential units. The heating system was updated 5 years ago, and the roof was completely replaced in 2018. What Robert didn't mention, but what was obvious to anyone with basic property assessment skills, was the water damage in the back corner, the outdated electrical system, and the foundation settling that had created a noticeable slope in the main floor. This building needed significant investment to bring it up to modern standards, which explained why it had been on the market so long despite its prime downtown location. But those issues also explained why we could acquire it for well below market value and why the current tenants, including Amanda, were paying below-market rent for spaces that would be worth considerably more after renovation. The current rental income is about $4,000 per month, Robert continued as we toured. Amanda's yoga studio space. But with some improvements and marketing to higher-end tenants, you could easily double that. I nodded and took notes, playing the role of interested but cautious investor, while internally calculating the real numbers. Vincent's acquisition team had already done a thorough financial analysis. The building was worth approximately $240,000 after necessary renovations, but Robert was asking $200,000 and would likely accept a $175,000 cash offer. The current tenants were paying a combined $4,000 monthly rent, but comparable renovated spaces in the area rented for $8,000, $10,000 per month. More importantly, controlling this building meant controlling Amanda's business location and, by extension, her financial stability. If Amanda had to relocate her yoga studio to a more expensive area, her profit margins would disappear entirely. If she had to pay market-rate rent at this location after renovation, she'd be forced to double her class prices or find additional revenue streams. "I'd like to make an offer," I said after we'd completed the tour. $175,000. Cash! 30-day closing. Robert's eyes widened with relief and gratitude. That's very generous, Mrs. Blackwood. I was hoping for closer to $200, but for a cash deal with quick closing, $175 is my best offer, I said, maintaining the professional tone I'd learned from watching Vincent negotiate. The building needs significant infrastructure updates, and there are some tenant lease complications that will require careful management during the transition. Tenant lease complications? Robert looked confused. All the current leases are month to month, very flexible for new ownership. Exactly, I said, letting him puzzle through the implications. Month-to-month leases meant I could terminate any tenancy with 30 days' notice. Amanda's yoga studio, the small cafe, the bookstore, all of them were completely vulnerable to eviction if the new ownership decided to pursue different tenant arrangements. Robert agreed to the offer with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been drowning and had just been thrown a life preserver. We arranged to meet Wednesday morning to sign the purchase agreement, with closing scheduled for the first week of November. By Thanksgiving, I would own the building where my daughter-in-law operated her business, completely unaware that her former mother-in-law, whom Tyler had dismissed as irrelevant, now held her financial future in her hands. The second property viewing was more complex, a mixed-use development on the waterfront that included retail space, a small marina, and residential units. The current owner, Patricia Fleming, was a shrewd businesswoman in her 50s who'd built a successful property management company, but was looking to liquidate some assets before retirement. Morrison Development has an excellent reputation, Patricia said as we walked through the marina facility. I've followed Vincent Morrison's work in other markets, and his projects consistently maintain their value while improving community infrastructure. That's exactly what Millbrook needs. Development that enhances rather than exploits. I appreciated Patricia's perspective because it reflected the attitude I'd need to cultivate among Millbrook's business community. Vincent's success wasn't built on extracting maximum profit from desperate sellers, but on creating sustainable value that benefited all stakeholders. The Morrison-Blackwood partnership would succeed only if we could demonstrate genuine commitment to community improvement, not just profit maximization. What's your vision for this property? Patricia asked as we examined the retail spaces that currently housed a bait shop, a small restaurant, and a seasonal ice cream stand. Mixed-use development that serves both locals and visitors, I said, drawing on conversations Vincent and I had had about waterfront properties. Upgrade the marina facilities to attract higher-end boat owners. Develop the retail space for restaurants and shops that operate year-round rather than seasonally. And create residential units that appeal to young professionals and retirees who want waterfront living without the isolation of rural properties. Patricia nodded approvingly. That's exactly what this area needs. The seasonal businesses barely break even, and the current residential units are outdated and poorly maintained. But with the right investment and management, it could become a genuine community asset rather than just a collection of struggling businesses, I finished. We spent 2 hours walking through every aspect of the property, from the electrical systems to the septic arrangements to the zoning restrictions that would affect development options. Patricia's asking price was $850,000, which Vincent's team had already determined was fair for the property's potential value after renovation. More importantly, controlling the waterfront development would give Morrison Blackwood Development significant influence over tourism and recreation policies that affected the entire town. I'm prepared to make a formal offer, I told Patricia as we concluded the tour. $800,000 cash, 45-day closing to allow time for proper inspections and permit applications. That's very reasonable, Patricia said. I'll have my attorney review the terms and get back to you by Wednesday. The third property viewing was perhaps the most strategically important. The office building where David's pharmaceutical company leased space for their regional headquarters. The building owner, Margaret Torres, a coincidence that amused me given my own name, was a successful attorney who'd inherited the property from her father, but had no interest in property management. I've been looking for the right buyer for 3 years, Margaret Torres explained as she showed me through the building's common areas. I want someone who will maintain the professional atmosphere and keep quality tenants, not just maximize rental income through subdivision and overcrowding. The building housed 6 businesses, including David's company, a law firm, an accounting practice, a financial advisory group, and 2 smaller professional services companies. All had multi-year leases at rates that were approximately 20% below current market value, which made the building attractive to tenants but limited its profitability for ownership. The current rental income is about $18,000 per month, Margaret Torres continued, but several leases are up for renewal in the next 18 months. With market rate adjustments, you could probably increase that to $25,000 or $26,000. $25,000 per month in rental income meant $300,000 annually from a building that could be purchased for $1.2 million. Even accounting for maintenance, taxes, and management costs, it represented a solid return on investment. But the real value wasn't financial, it was strategic. David's company paid $4,200 monthly rent for their office space. At market rates, similar space would cost $6,000, $7,000 per month. When their lease came up for renewal next summer, David would either need to negotiate with his landlord for continued below-market rent or face a significant increase in operating expenses that would affect his sales territory's profitability, unless, of course, his landlord happened to be his mother, who might be willing to discuss lease terms that reflected not just market considerations, but also family dynamics and recent behavioral issues involving his son. I'm very interested in this property, I told Margaret Torres as we examined David's company's office space. Morrison Development specializes in maintaining stable, professional tenant relationships while ensuring fair market returns for property owners. That's exactly what I'm looking for, she said with obvious relief. I'll accept $1,200,000 for the building, with 60-day closing to allow current tenants time to adjust to the ownership transition. I think we can work with those terms, I said, making notes about lease expiration dates and tenant contact information. I'll have my attorney prepare a formal offer by Thursday. By the time I left the office building, it was 11:30 a.m., and I was due for lunch with Mayor Patricia Wells at 12:30. I drove back to my new office to review notes and prepare for what would essentially be my introduction to Millbrook's political establishment as Margaret Blackwood, business partner and community development leader. Maria Santos had transformed my office into a functional workspace during the morning. File folders were organized by property and project, a sophisticated phone system had been installed and programmed, and fresh flowers on the conference table created an atmosphere of professional warmth. Maria herself was exactly what I'd expected. From Vincent's recommendation, mid-30s, bilingual, with a master's degree in business administration and 5 years of experience supporting executive-level real estate development work. "Good morning, Mrs. Blackwood," Maria said, handing me a folder of documents and a cup of coffee prepared exactly as I'd requested. "Your lunch reservation with Mayor Wells is confirmed for 12:30 at Riverside Restaurant. I've prepared a briefing packet with information about current city development policies and upcoming infrastructure projects that might affect your acquisition timeline." The briefing packet was thorough and professionally prepared, with charts showing population growth, trends, zoning maps, tax revenue projections, and summaries of recent city council meetings. Vincent had clearly instructed Maria to provide me with executive-level support, and she was delivering exactly that. "I've also taken the liberty of scheduling follow-up meetings with the 3 property owners you met with this morning," Maria continued. "Mr. Hartley Wednesday at 10 a.m. for purchase agreement signing, Ms. Fleming Thursday at 2 p.m. for contract review, and Ms. Torres Friday at 11 a.m. for formal offer presentation." "Excellent," I said, reviewing the documents with growing confidence. "Please also schedule a conference call with Vincent for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. to review acquisition progress and discuss community relations strategy." "Already on your calendar," Maria said with a smile. "Is there anything else you need for the lunch meeting with Mayor Wells?" I looked through the briefing packet one more time, noting key points about Millbrook's economic development priorities and challenges. Mayor Wells had been elected on a platform of sustainable growth and infrastructure improvement, which aligned perfectly with Morrison Blackwood Development's community-focused approach. "I think I'm ready," I said, gathering the documents and checking my appearance in the small mirror Maria had placed near my desk. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the grandmother who'd been slapped at a family dinner 6 days ago. This woman looked competent, professional, authoritative, someone whose opinions mattered and whose presence commanded respect. Riverside Restaurant was Millbrook's most upscale dining establishment, the kind of place where business deals were concluded and political alliances were formed over expertly prepared seafood and imported wine. I'd eaten there exactly twice in my entire life, once for David and Amanda's anniversary dinner 5 years ago, and once for my 65th birthday, when David had taken me for what he'd called a special celebration, but which had felt more like obligation than affection. Mayor Patricia Wells was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, studying what appeared to be budget documents while sipping a glass of white wine. Patricia was in her early 60s, with silver hair cut in a professional bob and the confident bearing of someone who'd spent decades navigating small-town politics. She'd been a successful real estate agent before running for mayor, which meant she understood both the business and political implications of large-scale development projects. "Margaret," she said, rising to shake my hand with genuine warmth. "I have to say, I was surprised when Morrison Development reached out about establishing a local partnership. Vincent Morrison doesn't usually work with smaller markets like Millbrook. Vincent believes that smaller communities often offer the best opportunities for sustainable development," I said, settling into my chair and accepting the wine menu from our server. "Less bureaucratic complexity, stronger community connections, and more potential for projects that genuinely improve quality of life, rather than just generating profit." "That's refreshing to hear," Patricia said. "We've had developers approach us before with grandiose plans that would have transformed Millbrook into something unrecognizable. The city council is very committed to preserving our small-town character while encouraging responsible growth. Over the next hour and a half, Patricia and I discussed Millbrook's development needs, infrastructure challenges, and long-term planning goals. She was particularly interested in waterfront development that could attract tourism without overwhelming local resources, and residential projects that would appeal to young families without displacing longtime residents. The biggest challenge we face is balancing growth with affordability, Patricia explained as we shared a dessert of locally sourced berry tart. Young people who grow up here often can't afford to stay because housing costs are rising faster than local wages. But if we don't encourage some development, we'll become a retirement community with no economic vitality. That's exactly the kind of challenge Morrison Blackwood Development wants to address, I said. Vincent's approach has always been to create mixed-income communities that serve multiple demographics rather than pursuing maximum profit from luxury development alone. Patricia leaned forward with obvious interest. Can you give me some specific examples of how that might work in Millbrook? I pulled out the property maps Maria had prepared and spread them on the table between us. Take the waterfront development, for instance. Instead of converting everything to high-end condominiums, we could create a mix of market-rate and affordable housing, combined with commercial space for local businesses and recreational facilities that serve the entire community. Patricia studied the maps with the focused attention of someone who'd spent years evaluating development proposals. This is very impressive, Margaret. You've clearly done extensive research into our local needs and constraints. I've lived in Millbrook my entire life, I said, allowing a note of personal pride to enter my professional tone. I understand this community in ways that outside developers never could. That's why Vincent asked me to be his local partner. He wants someone who's invested in Millbrook's long-term success, not just short-term profitability. Well, you certainly have my support for this approach, Patricia said, making notes on her copy of the property maps. What kind of timeline are you considering for these projects? We're hoping to begin property acquisitions immediately, with construction starting in spring on the first phase of development. The goal is to have visible progress within 12 months and substantial completion within 3 years. Patricia nodded approvingly. That's ambitious but realistic, and it would coincide nicely with some infrastructure improvements the city has been planning. Upgraded water and sewer systems, road improvements, expanded public transportation. As we concluded lunch, Patricia offered to introduce me to key city council members and department heads who would be involved in permitting and approval processes. She also suggested that I consider joining the Chamber of Commerce and attending the monthly business leaders' breakfast, where I could build relationships with other stakeholders in Millbrook's economic development. I think Morrison Blackwood Development could be exactly what Millbrook needs, Patricia said as we prepared to leave. Someone with Vincent Morrison's resources and your local knowledge and commitment, that's a powerful combination. Walking back to my office after lunch, I felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the wine or the excellent food. I'd just concluded a successful business meeting with the mayor of my hometown, discussing million-dollar development projects as if I'd been handling such negotiations my entire career. 6 days ago, Tyler had dismissed me as a powerless old woman whose opinions didn't matter. Today, I was being courted by local political leadership as a key player in shaping Millbrook's future. The afternoon conference call with Vincent went even better than I'd hoped. I was able to report successful initial meetings with all 3 target property owners, positive reception from Mayor Wells, and clear pathways for both acquisition and development approval processes. Margaret, I'm impressed, Vincent said, and I could hear genuine pleasure in his voice. Most of my new business partners take months to develop the kind of community relationships you've established in one day. You're a natural at this. I think it helps that I'm not seen as an outsider coming in to exploit opportunities, I said. People trust me because they know I have the same long-term interests in Millbrook's success that they do. Exactly. That's why this partnership works so well. I provide the capital and development expertise, you provide the community credibility and local knowledge. Together, we can accomplish things that neither of us could achieve alone. Vincent and I spent another 30 minutes discussing acquisition strategies, development timelines, and community relations approaches. By the time we hung up, I had clear authorization to proceed with all 3 property acquisitions and approval to increase the initial development budget if necessary to secure key strategic properties. As I prepared to leave the office at the end of my first official day as a business executive, Maria handed me a folder of messages and appointments for the rest of the week. 3 more property viewings, meetings with contractors and architects, and a presentation to the Chamber of Commerce Board about Morrison Blackwood Development's community vision. "Mrs. Blackwood," Maria said as I gathered my materials, "I wanted to say how much I'm enjoying working with you. Mr. Morrison told me you were someone special, but I can see for myself that you're going to be an extraordinary business leader." Walking to my car in the late afternoon sunlight, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in less than a week. Tuesday night, I'd been the dismissed grandmother whose opinions didn't matter enough to protect her from assault. Monday afternoon, I was the business partner whose vision would shape the future of the town where Tyler, David, and Amanda would have to live and work for the foreseeable future. They had no idea what was coming. No idea that the woman they'd written off as irrelevant was about to become one of the most powerful people in their world. No idea that their access to employment, housing, and business opportunities would soon depend on maintaining a respectful relationship with someone they'd treated as disposable. But they would learn. Very soon, they would all learn exactly what they'd lost when they chose Tyler's comfort over my dignity. The transformation was accelerating, and there would be no going back. 3 months to the day after Tyler's hand connected with my face, I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my new corner office, adjusting the collar of a navy blue power suit that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in 2 months. The woman looking back at me bore no resemblance to the grandmother, who'd been dismissed as irrelevant at a birthday dinner. This woman owned half of downtown Millbrook, controlled the financial futures of everyone who'd hurt her, and was about to make the biggest announcement in the town's recent history. The Millbrook Herald had already delivered the morning edition to every doorstep and business in town. The front page headline read in bold letters, "Morrison Blackwood Development announces $12 million Millbrook expansion project." Below it was a professional photograph of Vincent and me standing in front of the recently acquired waterfront property, both of us smiling with the confidence of people who held all the cards. The article, which I'd carefully reviewed before publication, detailed the scope of our development plans, our commitment to community-centered growth, and our vision for Millbrook's economic future. It mentioned my role as managing partner and local community liaison, describing me as a lifelong Millbrook resident with extensive experience in business development and community relations. What the article didn't mention was that Margaret Blackwood now owned the building where Amanda operated her yoga studio, the office complex where David's company maintained their regional headquarters, and 3 other key properties that controlled access to employment and business opportunities throughout the town. What it didn't mention was that Tyler's grandmother had transformed from powerless victim to the person who would determine whether his family maintained their comfortable lifestyle or found themselves suddenly struggling to afford the basic securities they'd taken for granted. But Tyler and his family would learn all of that very soon. Because today was the day I'd arranged for them to discover exactly who Margaret Blackwood really was. At 10 a.m., I walked into the Millbrook Community Center for the official announcement presentation, flanked by Vincent, Mayor Patricia Wells, and 3 members of the City Council. The auditorium was packed with local business owners, residents, and reporters from regional newspapers and television stations. Vincent had insisted on professional media coverage to ensure that Morrison Blackwood Development's launch generated the kind of positive publicity that would attract additional investment and development to the area. As I took my place at the podium, I scanned the audience and found exactly who I was looking for: David sat in the third row, his face a mask of confusion and growing realization. Amanda was beside him, her yoga studio's future suddenly uncertain now that she understood who her new landlord would be. And there, slouched in a back row seat, with his arms crossed and a smirk on his face, was Tyler, still unemployed, still living in his parents' basement, still completely unaware that his life was about to change permanently. "Good morning, and thank you all for coming," I began, my voice carrying easily through the auditorium with the confidence of someone who'd spent 3 months learning to command rooms full of successful people. "My name is Margaret Blackwood, and I'm honored to serve as managing partner for Morrison Blackwood Development's expansion into Millbrook." I watched Tyler's smirk falter slightly as he processed my name. Margaret Blackwood, not Margaret Henderson, the grandmother he'd dismissed. Margaret Blackwood, the business executive whose decisions would affect his access to employment, housing, and opportunities in the only town he'd ever known. 3 months ago, I continued, looking directly at Tyler as I spoke, I made a commitment to help bring sustainable, community-focused development to Millbrook. Today, I'm proud to announce that Morrison Blackwood Development has acquired 7 key properties throughout our downtown and waterfront areas, with plans for $12 million in improvements that will create jobs, attract new businesses, and enhance quality of life for all residents. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause, but I kept my eyes focused on my family's section. David had gone pale as he began to understand the implications. Amanda was whispering urgently, to him, probably asking how his mother had somehow become a major property developer without anyone in the family knowing. Tyler was still processing, his expression shifting from confusion to suspicion to something that might have been the first stirring of genuine concern. Vincent took the podium next, detailing the technical aspects of our development plans and the economic benefits Morrison Blackwood Development would bring to Millbrook. He spoke with the polished confidence of someone who'd delivered similar presentations in dozens of communities, but his words carried extra weight because everyone in the audience knew Vincent Morrison's reputation for successful, profitable development projects. "I want to emphasize," Vincent said as he concluded his remarks, "that this expansion represents a true partnership between Morrison Development's resources and expertise and Margaret Blackwood's deep understanding of Millbrook's unique character and needs. Margaret has been instrumental in identifying properties and opportunities that will benefit the entire community while preserving the small-town atmosphere that makes Millbrook special." Mayor Wells spoke next, expressing the city's enthusiasm for the project and outlining the infrastructure improvements and policy changes that would support Morrison Blackwood Development's vision. She specifically praised my community involvement and commitment to transparent, collaborative development processes. Then it was my turn again, and this was the moment I'd been planning for 3 months. "Before we open for questions," I said, returning to the podium, "I want to address something that's particularly important to me as a lifelong Millbrook resident. This development project isn't just about buildings and businesses. It's about creating opportunities for all members of our community to thrive and succeed." I paused, letting that statement settle, then looked directly at Tyler again. "However, opportunities require responsibility. Employment requires reliability. Respect requires respectful behavior. Morrison Blackwood Development is committed to working with individuals and businesses that share our values of professionalism, integrity, and community contribution." Tyler was no longer smirking. He was sitting up straighter, his eyes narrowed as he began to understand that this presentation somehow involved him personally. "We believe that everyone deserves a second chance to demonstrate their best qualities," I continued, my voice carrying the authority of someone who controlled millions of dollars in local investment. "But second chances are earned through accountability, genuine remorse, and sustained behavioral change. We look forward to working with community members who are ready to embrace those principles." The applause that followed was polite but puzzled. Most of the audience didn't understand the personal subtext of my remarks, but they didn't need to. The message was intended for an audience of 3 people, and all three of them had received it clearly. During the question and answer session that followed, several business owners asked about employment opportunities with Morrison Blackwood, development, and our subcontractors. I took careful notes of each question, making sure that Tyler could see me writing down names and contact information of people who would be prioritized for job interviews and business partnerships. One question came from Jennifer Martinez, who owned a struggling restaurant near the waterfront. Will existing businesses have opportunities to expand or relocate within the new development areas? Absolutely, I said, looking directly at Amanda as I answered. We're very interested in supporting local businesses that align with our vision for community enhancement. However, business partnerships will be based on factors including operational excellence, community reputation, and the personal character of business owners. We want to work with people who represent the best of Millbrook's values. Amanda's face had gone white. She understood now that her yoga studio's lease, her business location, and her access to the premium commercial spaces in Morrison Blackwood Development's projects would all depend on maintaining a positive relationship with the woman her family had allowed Tyler to assault without consequence. After the presentation concluded, I was surrounded by community members wanting to congratulate me, ask follow-up questions, and express their excitement about Millbrook's development prospects. I spent 30 minutes shaking hands, exchanging business cards, and scheduling follow-up meetings with potential partners and collaborators. Throughout these conversations, I was aware of David, Amanda, and Tyler huddled together near the back of the auditorium, clearly trying to decide how to approach me. David looked like a man who'd just realized that the mother he'd taken for granted had somehow acquired the power to control his family's financial future. Amanda appeared to be arguing with Tyler, probably trying to convince him that whatever he was planning to say or do, it was a terrible idea. Tyler, for his part, looked like someone whose world had just been turned upside down. The grandmother he'd dismissed as a powerless old woman was now the person who controlled access to employment and business opportunities throughout Millbrook. The family member he'd treated as disposable now held the keys to his parents' continued prosperity and his own ability to find work in the only town he'd ever known. Finally, as the crowd began to thin, David approached me with the careful demeanor of someone walking through a minefield. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the casual dismissiveness that had characterized our phone conversation 3 months ago. Could we talk? Privately?" "Of course, David," I said, maintaining the professional tone I'd perfected over the past 3 months. "My office is just across the street. Why don't you all come up and we can have a proper conversation?" The elevator ride to my office was silent except for the mechanical hum of machinery and Tyler's heavy breathing. When Maria opened the conference room door and ushered us inside, Amanda audibly gasped at the scope and elegance of the space. The mahogany table, leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Main Street spoke of serious money and real power in a way that couldn't be denied or dismissed. "Please, sit down," I said, taking my place at the head of the conference table while Maria served coffee and closed the door behind her. "I imagine you have some questions." David cleared his throat and leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "Mom, I don't understand what's happening here. 3 months ago you were… how did I become the managing partner of a $12 million development company?" I finished calmly. "That's an excellent question, David. The answer involves a phone call I made the night Tyler slapped me." Tyler flinched at the direct reference to his assault, but I continued without pausing. "I called someone I'd worked with 15 years ago, someone who understood my value even when my own family didn't. Vincent Morrison and I had maintained a professional relationship, and when I needed help, he offered me an opportunity to demonstrate capabilities that I'd been hiding for decades." "Hiding?" Amanda's voice was barely above a whisper. "What capabilities?" I opened a folder and spread out documents across the conference table, property deeds, development contracts, financial statements, and business plans that represented 3 months of strategic acquisition and planning. Amanda, I own the building where your yoga studio operates, I said matter-of-factly. Your lease expires at the end of next month, and renewal will depend on several factors, including your ability to demonstrate the kind of respect and professionalism that Morrison Blackwood Development expects from our business partners. Amanda's face went from white to green. You're my landlord? I am. David, I also own the office building where your pharmaceutical company maintains their regional headquarters. Your company's lease expires next summer, and renewal. Terms will reflect current market rates unless there are compelling reasons to offer below-market pricing to tenants who've demonstrated exceptional character and community contribution. David's mouth opened and closed without sound. He was beginning to understand that his mother, the woman he'd failed to protect from assault, the woman he'd called only once in 3 months to offer inadequate apologies and excuses, now controlled his company's operating expenses and, by extension, his own employment security. Tyler, I said, turning to my grandson who was slouched in his chair with a sullen expression that hadn't changed since he was a teenager, I control approximately 60% of the entry-level employment opportunities that will be created by Morrison Blackwood Development over the next 2 years. I also have significant influence over hiring decisions at local businesses that depend on our projects for revenue and growth. Tyler's sullen expression shifted to something approaching panic. You can't stop me from getting a job just because of one mistake. One mistake? I repeated, my voice carrying the steel that Vincent had taught me to use when someone tried to minimize serious issues. Tyler, you physically assaulted your 70-year-old grandmother at her birthday dinner in front of 12 family members. That wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. A choice that revealed your character and your attitude toward people you consider less powerful than yourself. I leaned forward, making sure Tyler could see the complete seriousness in my eyes. But you're right about one thing. I'm not going to stop you from getting a job. I'm going to give you the opportunity to earn employment through the same process as everyone else. You can apply for positions with Morrison Blackwood Development or our partner. Businesses. You can interview, submit references, and demonstrate your qualifications and reliability just like any other candidate. Tyler straightened slightly, apparently thinking this sounded reasonable. However, I continued, employment decisions will be based on factors including work history, personal character, community reputation, and the ability to maintain respectful, professional relationships with colleagues and supervisors. Candidates who have histories of violence, alcohol abuse, or disrespectful behavior toward family members may find it challenging to meet our hiring standards. The silence that followed was profound. Tyler was finally beginning to understand that his grandmother, the woman he'd dismissed as powerless, now controlled his access to economic opportunities in the only place he'd ever lived. David was realizing that his mother could make his company's operations significantly more expensive if she chose to. Amanda was grasping that her business's survival depended on maintaining a positive relationship with someone her family had failed to protect from assault. "What do you want from us?" David finally asked, his voice carrying a note of desperation that I'd never heard before. "I want what I've always wanted, David," I said quietly. "Respect, dignity, the basic courtesy that should exist between family, members who care about each other. I want Tyler to take responsibility for his actions and demonstrate genuine remorse through sustained behavioral change. I want you and Amanda to acknowledge that your silence and inaction after Tyler hit me was a failure of character and family loyalty." I paused, letting those words settle. "Most importantly, I want all of you to understand that relationships have consequences. When you treat someone as disposable, you risk discovering that you were wrong about their value and their power. When you fail to protect someone you claim to love, you damage trust in ways that can't be easily repaired." Amanda was crying now, quiet tears that she wiped away with trembling hands. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. I should have said something immediately. I should have defended you. I was shocked and scared, and I didn't know what to do. But that's not an excuse. You didn't deserve what happened, and you definitely didn't deserve our silence afterward. It was the first genuine apology I'd received from anyone in the family, and it carried weight because Amanda had nothing to gain by offering it. My decision about her lease renewal had already been made. I would honor fair market terms because Amanda ran a good business that served the community well. But her apology mattered because it acknowledged the harm that had been done and accepted responsibility for her part in it. "Thank you, Amanda," I said sincerely. "That means more to me than you know." David took a shaky breath and looked directly at me for the first time since we'd sat down. "Mom, I failed you. As your son, as a man, as a human being. I should have immediately told Tyler to leave and demanded that he apologize. I should have called you that same night to make sure you were okay and to tell you how sorry I was for not protecting you. Instead, I waited 3 months and then called to make excuses and minimize what happened." His voice broke slightly as he continued. "I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. I want to be the son you deserve to have in that moment, even if it's too late to change what actually happened." David's apology was more difficult for me to process because it involved not just the immediate failure to protect me, but decades of taking my love and support for granted. The mother who'd worked double shifts to pay for his college, who'd attended every baseball game and school play, who'd provided emotional and practical support through every crisis and transition of his adult life, that mother had earned better treatment than silent acceptance of her public humiliation. But David was my son, and despite everything that had happened, I loved him enough to hope that our relationship could be rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect rather than his assumption of my unconditional availability. "David, I appreciate your apology, and I believe you mean it," I said carefully. "Rebuilding trust will take time and sustained effort, but I'm willing to try if you are." Then I turned to Tyler, who was staring at the conference table with the expression of someone who'd finally realized that his actions had consequences beyond his immediate convenience. "Tyler," I said, waiting until he looked up and met my eyes. "Do you have something you'd like to say?" Tyler's jaw worked silently for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller and less certain than I'd heard since he was a child. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I was drunk and angry about stuff that had nothing to do with you, and I took it out on you because I thought you wouldn't fight back. I thought I could treat you badly, and there wouldn't be any real consequences because you'd always just forgive me, and things would go back to normal." He paused, swallowing hard. "I was wrong about everything. You're not powerless, and you shouldn't have to forgive me just because we're family. I don't know how to make this right, but I want to try." Tyler's apology was different from David's and Amanda's because it acknowledged not just the immediate harm, but the underlying attitude that had made the assault possible. He'd hit me because he'd thought I was safe to abuse, someone who wouldn't, or couldn't fight back, someone whose dignity was less important than his momentary anger. "Tyler," I said, considering my words carefully, "accountability means more than apology. It means changing the behaviors and attitudes that led to harmful actions. It means demonstrating through sustained effort that you've learned from your mistakes and become someone who can be trusted with responsibility and respect." I leaned back in my chair, looking at all three of them. "Morrison Blackwood Development will be hiring for various positions over the next 6 months. Construction work, administrative support, customer service, project coordination. Tyler, you're welcome to apply for any position you're qualified for, but you'll go through the same interview process, background checks, and probationary periods as every other candidate. Your family connection to me won't guarantee you employment, and it won't protect you from termination if your performance or behavior doesn't meet our standards." Tyler nodded, apparently understanding that this was the best offer he was going to receive. "However," I continued, "if you do earn a position with our company, you'll have the opportunity to demonstrate the kind of person you can choose to become. You'll have structure, purpose, and the chance to contribute meaningfully to your community's development. Whether you succeed or fail will depend entirely on the effort and character you bring to the work. The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical issues like lease terms, employment procedures, and family relationship boundaries. By the time they left my office, we'd established a framework for moving forward that acknowledged both the harm that had been done and the possibility of earning forgiveness through sustained behavioral change. As I watched them walk across Main Street toward their car, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Satisfaction at having achieved a position of strength and respect. Relief that the transformation I'd undergone had been recognized and validated by the people who'd hurt me. Sadness that our family relationships had required such drastic measures to reach a foundation of mutual respect. But more than anything, I felt pride. Pride in the woman I'd become, the power I'd earned, and the community I was helping to build. Tyler had slapped me because he'd thought I was weak and disposable. He'd learned instead that I was strong enough to rebuild my entire identity and strategic enough to control the circumstances of his life going forward. Vincent called that evening to congratulate me on the successful announcement and to discuss next steps for our development projects. But before we hung up, he said something that meant more to me than all the business success we'd achieved. "Margaret, I hope you know that the woman who took on this challenge 3 months ago was always there, even when your family couldn't. See her. You didn't become powerful. You just finally got the opportunity to demonstrate the power you'd always had." That night, I sat in my small house on Maple Street, the house I'd paid off with money I'd earned from Vincent 15 years ago, the house that now served as a retreat from my corner office and executive responsibilities, and reflected on the transformation that had brought me to this moment. Margaret Henderson had been grateful for scraps, apologetic for taking up space, willing to accept less than she deserved in order to maintain family harmony. Margaret Blackwood demanded respect, controlled resources, and created the terms under which relationships would continue or end. Both women were me, but only one of them had the power to ensure that Tyler would never again feel safe hitting someone he considered powerless. Only one of them could guarantee that David would never again assume his mother's love and support were unconditional obligations rather than gifts that required reciprocal respect. Only one of them could build something meaningful that would outlast family drama and personal grievances. Tyler had given me something to regret, all right. He'd made me regret all the years I'd spent making myself smaller to accommodate other people's comfort. He'd made me regret all the times I'd accepted less than I deserved, because demanding more seemed too difficult or confrontational. But most of all, he'd made me regret waiting 70 years to discover that I'd always had the strength to control my own destiny. I just needed someone to slap me hard enough to wake me up. The transformation was complete, and Margaret Blackwood was just getting started. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that could have happened. Tyler thought he was putting me in my place. Instead, he showed me exactly where my place really was, not as the grateful recipient of other people's tolerance, but as the architect of my own power and the guardian of my own dignity. If someone in your life is treating you like you don't matter, maybe it's time to show them exactly how much you do. Maybe it's time to stop being grateful for scraps and start demanding the feast you've earned, because respect isn't a gift. It's a requirement. And sometimes the only way to teach people your worth is to show them the cost of losing you. What's your story? Share it in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe for more stories about turning your worst day into your biggest victory. You're never too old, never too late, never too powerless to rewrite your story. Sometimes, you just need the right motivation to begin.